Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates played with dolls and dreamed of becoming teachers or nurses, she spent her afternoons at her grandfather's ranch, learning to shoot tin cans off fence posts with an old hunting rifle. Her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran named Roberto, saw something special in the way she held the weapon. Steady hands, calm breathing, and eyes that never wavered from the target. The summer Sarah turned 16, her world changed forever. Her older brother Miguel came home from his second tour in Afghanistan, but he wasn't the same person who had left 2 years earlier. He jumped at sudden noises, stayed awake all night, and sometimes stared at nothing for hours. Sarah watched her parents struggle to understand what had happened to their son, but she knew instinctively that something terrible had scarred him during his time overseas. One evening, as thunderclouds gathered over the ranch, Miguel found Sarah practicing her shooting behind the barn. She had set up empty bottles at increasing distances, starting at 50 yards and working her way back to nearly 200. What impressed him wasn't just her accuracy, it was her patience. She took her time with each shot, controlling her breathing, adjusting for wind, and never rushing. "You're good at this," Miguel said, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before his deployment. "Better than most soldiers I served with." Sarah lowered her rifle and turned to face her brother. In the fading light, she could see the haunted look in his eyes that had become so familiar since his return. "Grandpa taught me well," she replied simply. Miguel sat down on an old wooden crate and watched his sister reset her targets. "There are people over there who need help," he said quietly. "Good people caught in the middle of something they didn't choose. Sometimes the only thing standing between them and danger is someone like you, someone who can make the impossible shot when it matters most." That night, Sarah lay in her bed listening to the rain pound against her window. Her brother's words echoed in her mind, mixing with memories of her grandfather's stories about serving his country and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. She had always known she was meant for something bigger than their small town, but now she began to understand what that might be. The next morning, Sarah found herself at the local Army recruiting station in town. Staff Sergeant Davis, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, listened as Sarah explained her interest in military service. When Sarah mentioned her shooting abilities, the sergeant's eyebrows raised slightly. "How far can you consistently hit a target?" Davis asked. 800 yards with iron sights," Sarah replied honestly. "Maybe further with proper equipment." Davis leaned back in her chair, studying the 17-year-old girl in front of her. "That's impressive for someone your age. Have you considered what military occupation specialty might interest you?" Sarah had done her research. She knew about infantry, military police, and various support roles. But there was one field that had captured her imagination completely. "I want to be a sniper," she said with quiet determination. The sergeant's expression grew serious. "That's not an easy path, especially for women. The training is brutal, both physically and mentally. The job itself requires making decisions that will stay with you for the rest of your life. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah thought about her brother's nightmares, about the weight he carried since returning home. She thought about her grandfather's stories and the pride in his voice when he talked about protecting his fellow soldiers. Most of all, she thought about the people Miguel had described. Innocent families caught in war zones who needed someone willing to stand between them and danger. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "I'm prepared." The months that followed were a blur of preparation. Sarah spent every free moment at the shooting range, pushing herself to hit targets at greater distances under increasingly difficult conditions. She ran 5 miles every morning before school, building the endurance she would need for military training. She studied military history, tactics, and marksmanship theory with the same intensity she once reserved for favorite novels. Her parents were initially resistant to the idea of their daughter joining the military, especially in a combat role. But as they watched Sarah's determination and saw how seriously she approached her preparation, they began to understand that this wasn't just a teenage whim, it was her calling. Grandfather Roberto was Sarah's strongest supporter. He helped her practice advanced shooting techniques, teaching her how to read wind patterns, adjust for elevation changes, and maintain focus under pressure. "The rifle is just a tool," he told her during one of their practice sessions. "The real weapon is your mind. Stay calm, think clearly, and trust your training." On Sarah's 18th birthday, she officially enlisted in the United States Army. The ceremony was small, just her immediate family and Sergeant Davis, who had become something of a mentor over the past year. As Sarah raised her right hand and recited the oath of enlistment, she felt a profound sense of purpose settling over her like a warm blanket. Her first challenge would be basic combat training at Fort Moore, Georgia. Sarah knew that only a small percentage of soldiers were selected for sniper training, and even fewer completed the program successfully. The competition would be fierce, and she would have to prove herself against candidates who had been preparing for years. The night before leaving for basic training, Sarah sat on her grandfather's porch, looking out over the ranch where she had learned to shoot. The old man joined her carrying 2 cups of coffee and settling into his favorite rocking chair. "Are you scared?" he asked gently. Sarah considered the question carefully. She was nervous about the unknown challenges ahead, worried about disappointing the people who believed in her, and aware that she was embarking on a path that would fundamentally change who she was. But scared? No, she wasn't scared. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah Martinez prepared to begin a journey that would test every limit she thought she had and discover reserves of strength she never knew existed. The rifle range behind the barn had been her classroom, but the real education was about to begin. The bus ride to Fort Moore felt like traveling to another planet. Sarah pressed her face against the window, watching the familiar landscape of Texas give way to the rolling hills of Georgia. Around her, dozens of other young recruits tried to hide their nervousness with loud conversations and nervous laughter. Some had been planning military careers since childhood, while others seemed as uncertain about their future as Sarah felt determined about hers. Drill Sergeant Collins was not what Sarah had expected. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, the woman commanded attention through sheer force of personality, rather than physical intimidation. Her voice could cut through chaos like a blade, and her eyes seemed to see everything that happened within a 50-yard radius. Within hours of arrival, every recruit understood that underestimating Sergeant Collins would be a serious mistake. "Martinez," Collins barked during the first morning formation. "You're the one who thinks she's Annie Oakley, right?" Sarah stood perfectly straight, eyes forward. "I'm here to serve my country, Drill Sergeant." Collins walked slowly around Sarah, examining her like a scientist studying an interesting specimen. "We'll see about that. Texas farm girls don't automatically make good soldiers. You'll earn your place here like everyone else." The first weeks of basic training were a brutal introduction to military life. Sarah had thought her early morning runs back home had prepared her for the physical demands, but she quickly learned there was a vast difference between exercising on her own schedule and being pushed beyond her limits by professional instructors, who seemed to delight in finding new ways to test her endurance. The obstacle course was particularly challenging. Sarah's height, or lack thereof, made some obstacles genuinely difficult, while others seemed designed specifically to humble recruits who thought they were already in good shape. She watched taller, stronger candidates glide over walls that required her to use every technique her grandfather had taught her about problem-solving under pressure, but it was on the rifle range where Sarah truly distinguished herself. The standard Army rifle felt different from her grandfather's hunting weapons, but the fundamental principles remained the same: breathing, sight alignment, trigger control. These were skills that had been drilled into her muscle memory over years of practice. During her first qualification shoot, Sarah scored expert on every distance. While other recruits struggled to hit targets at 300 yards, she was putting rounds exactly where she intended them to go. Drill Sergeant Collins said nothing during the exercise, but Sarah noticed the woman paying close attention to her technique. Private Johnson, a recruit from Chicago who had quickly become the unofficial leader of their squad, approached Sarah that evening during equipment maintenance time. "How did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked with genuine curiosity rather than resentment. "My grandfather taught me," Sarah replied, carefully cleaning her rifle with the same attention to detail Roberto had insisted upon. He always said the rifle was just a tool, but treating it with respect was the first step toward becoming truly skilled. Johnson nodded thoughtfully. "My dad tried to teach me when I was younger, but I never had the patience for it. Always wanted to just point and shoot, you know?" Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself becoming an unofficial marksmanship instructor for her fellow recruits. She helped Johnson steady his breathing, showed Williams how to properly sight her weapon, and worked with Martinez, Another recruit who shared her last name but had grown up in urban Philadelphia on basic shooting fundamentals. Drill Sergeant Collins observed these informal training sessions with interest, but never intervened. Sarah suspected the sergeant was evaluating not just her shooting skills, but her ability to teach and lead others. These were qualities that would be essential if she hoped to advance to more specialized training. The physical training gradually became less daunting as Sarah's body adapted to the demanding schedule. She discovered that her smaller stature was actually an advantage during some exercises, particularly those requiring agility and endurance rather than pure strength. Her grandfather's ranch work had given her a solid foundation of functional fitness that served her well in military training. More importantly, Sarah was learning to think like a soldier. The military had its own language, its own customs, and its own way of approaching problems. Everything was systematic, methodical, and focused on mission success rather than individual glory. These lessons resonated with the values her grandfather had taught her, but applied them on a much larger scale. During the 6th week of training, Drill Sergeant Collins called Sarah aside after evening chow. "Martinez, walk with me," she said, leading Sarah away from the barracks toward the training areas. They walked in silence for several minutes before Collins stopped near the rifle range where Sarah had first demonstrated her abilities. The Georgia evening was warm and humid, with fireflies beginning to blink among the trees surrounding the base. "You're not here by accident," Collins said finally. "I've been doing this job for 12 years and I can spot the ones who have something special. You have it, the patience, the precision, the ability to stay calm under pressure. But more than that, you have the instinct to help others improve rather than just showing off your own skills." Sarah listened carefully. Unsure where this conversation was heading, Collins continued, "There are opportunities in the Army for soldiers with your particular talents, specialized training that goes beyond what we do here in basic. But those opportunities come with responsibilities that most people can't handle. They require sacrifices that change you permanently." "What kind of opportunities?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The kind where precision matters more than volume of fire, where one perfect shot can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, where you might spend days in position, waiting for a single moment that lasts less than a second." Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly. This was exactly what she had hoped for when she enlisted, but hearing it described so directly made it feel suddenly more real and more intimidating. "I'm interested," she said simply. Collins smiled for the first time since Sarah had met her. "I thought you might be. Finish basic training strong and we'll talk about next steps. But understand this, if you go down this path, there's no going back to being a regular soldier. The training will push you harder than anything you've experienced here. The missions will test every limit you have and then find new ones you didn't know existed." As they walked back toward the barracks, Sarah thought about her brother Miguel and the weight he carried from his combat experiences. She thought about her grandfather's stories and his quiet pride in having served his country well. Most of all, she thought about the opportunity to use her skills in service of something larger than herself. The remaining weeks of basic training passed quickly. Sarah continued to excel on the rifle range while steadily improving in other areas. She earned the respect of her fellow recruits not through intimidation or showboating, but by consistently performing well and helping others do the same. On graduation day, as Sarah stood in formation wearing her dress uniform for the first time, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had successfully completed the first phase of her military journey, proving to herself and her instructors that she belonged in the Army. But more importantly, she had been selected for the next phase, advanced training that would determine whether she had what it took to become one of the Army's most specialized and elite soldiers. Fort Benning's sniper school was unlike anything Sarah had imagined. The facility itself looked ordinary enough. Standard military buildings surrounded by training areas that could have been found on any Army base. But the atmosphere was different here. Every instructor moved with a quiet confidence that spoke of real combat experience, and every student had already proven themselves exceptional soldiers before being accepted into the program. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the school's lead instructor, addressed the incoming class of 24 candidates on their first morning. He was a compact man with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings automatically. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had applied these skills in life-or-death situations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez began, "you are here because you have demonstrated exceptional marksmanship abilities in your previous training. However, being a good shooter is only the beginning of what we do here. Over the next 8 weeks, we will determine whether you have what it takes to become precision marksman in combat situations." Sarah looked around at her fellow candidates. Most were men, ranging in age from early 20s to mid-30s. Several had already served combat tours and bore themselves with the quiet confidence of experienced soldiers. She was clearly the youngest person in the class and one of only 3 women, but she had learned in basic training not to let that intimidate her. The first week focused on advanced marksmanship fundamentals. Sarah discovered that her grandfather's informal training had given her an excellent foundation, but there was much more to learn. The instructors taught precise techniques for reading environmental conditions, not just wind speed and direction, but humidity, air pressure, and temperature variations that could affect bullet trajectory over long distances. "Martinez," Sergeant First Class Thompson called out during a particularly challenging wind reading exercise. "What's your call on this shot?" Sarah studied the range carefully. Grass was waving gently at the 500-yard line, but trees beyond the target area showed stronger movement. A mirage was visible through her scope, indicating heat rising from the ground. She made her calculations and adjusted her scope accordingly. Wind from left to right, approximately 8 miles per hour, increasing to 12 at distance. Temperature differential causing slight upward drift. Adjusting 2 clicks right, 1 click down. Thompson nodded approvingly. "Take the shot." The bullet struck exactly where Sarah had intended. Center mass on the target at 600 yards. Several of her classmates had struggled with the same conditions, but Sarah's careful observation and patient calculation had paid off. "Good work," Thompson said. "But remember, in a real situation, you might not have the luxury of multiple observations. Sometimes you get one chance to read conditions correctly, and lives depend on that accuracy." The second week introduced fieldcraft and camouflage techniques. Sarah learned to construct ghillie suits that would render her virtually invisible in various environments, and to move through terrain so quietly that instructors positioned just yards away couldn't detect her presence. This training appealed to skills she had developed hunting with her grandfather, but elevated them to a professional level. Private First Class Wilson, a soldier from Montana with extensive hunting experience, became Sarah's frequent training partner during these exercises. He was 6 years older than Sarah and had initially been skeptical about working with such a young soldier, but her consistent performance had earned his respect. "You move like you grew up in the woods," Wilson observed as they practiced stalking techniques through the Georgia pine forest surrounding the base. "Close," Sarah replied, adjusting the natural vegetation attached to her ghillie suit. "Ranch country in Texas. My grandfather taught me to move quietly when hunting, but this is much more advanced." Wilson nodded. "The principle is the same, though. Patience, observation, and respect for the environment. Most people rush things and end up giving away their position." The third week brought the psychological aspects of precision marksmanship. Sarah learned about stress management, decision-making under pressure, and the mental disciplines required to remain calm in combat situations. The instructors were frank about the realities of the job. There would be situations where a single shot would determine whether friendly forces lived or died, and there was no room for hesitation or error. Master Sergeant Rodriguez conducted a particularly sobering class on the ethical and legal aspects of their role. "You will be given missions that require you to engage specific targets at long range," he explained. "These are not random acts of violence. Every shot you take will be authorized through proper channels and will serve a specific military purpose. But once you pull that trigger, you own that decision for the rest of your life." Sarah thought about her brother Miguel and the weight he carried from his combat experiences. She was beginning to understand that the technical skills she was learning were only part of becoming an effective sniper. The mental preparation was equally important. The fourth week focused on advanced equipment and technology. Sarah learned to use high-powered scopes with various reticles, range-finding equipment, and communication systems that would allow her to coordinate with ground forces and command elements. The Barrett.50 caliber rifle was introduced during this phase, and Sarah was immediately impressed by its precision and power. The Barrett was significantly larger and heavier than the weapons she had trained with previously, but its capabilities were extraordinary. Under proper conditions, it could engage targets accurately at distances exceeding 1 mile. The rifle demanded perfect technique. Any flaw in shooting fundamentals would be magnified at extreme ranges. This weapon system represents the pinnacle of precision marksmanship technology, explained Staff Sergeant Kim, the school's equipment specialist. But remember, it's still just a tool. Your skills, judgment, and training are what make it effective. Sarah's first shots with the Barrett at 800 yards were slightly off-center, but she quickly adapted to the weapon's characteristics. By the end of the week, she was consistently hitting targets at distances that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The 5th and 6th weeks combined all previous training in complex field exercises. Students worked in 2-person teams, alternating between shooter and spotter roles while conducting simulated missions in realistic scenarios. Sarah partnered with Wilson, and they developed an effective working relationship based on clear communication and mutual trust. During one particularly challenging exercise, Sarah and Wilson were tasked with providing overwatch for a simulated patrol moving through hostile territory. They had to establish a concealed position, maintain observation for 6 hours, and be prepared to engage targets that threatened the patrol, all while remaining undetected by opposing forces played by instructors. The exercise tested every skill they had learned. Sarah spent hours motionless in her ghillie suit, observing the patrol's route through her scope while Wilson monitored radio communications and watched for threats from other directions. When opposing forces finally appeared and moved to ambush the patrol, Sarah had less than 30 seconds to identify the threat, calculate range and environmental factors, and take a precise shot. Her bullet struck the target cleanly at 750 yards, and the exercise controllers confirmed that her intervention had successfully neutralized the threat to the patrol. It was a moment of profound satisfaction. Her training was coming together, and she was beginning to think and act like a professional sniper. The 7th week brought the most challenging test yet, a comprehensive field exercise that would determine which candidates would successfully complete the course. Students were given a complex scenario involving multiple targets, changing environmental conditions, and time pressure that simulated actual combat stress. Sarah felt nervous but confident as she prepared for the final test. Her shooting had been consistently excellent throughout the course, and she had mastered the fieldcraft and tactical skills required for the role. More importantly, she had developed the mental discipline and decision-making abilities that would be essential in real-world situations. The night before the final exercise, she called her grandfather from a payphone outside the barracks. Roberto's familiar voice was exactly what she needed to hear. "How are you doing, Mija?" he asked warmly. "I'm ready," Sarah replied, and she meant it completely. The final exercise began before dawn on a humid Georgia morning. Sarah lay prone in her carefully constructed hide, watching the designated target area through her scope as morning mist slowly lifted from the valley below. Beside her, Wilson monitored radio communications and maintained overwatch on potential approach routes. They had been in position for 3 hours, and the test had only just begun. The scenario was complex and realistic. A high-value target would appear somewhere within a 2-square-mile area, but the exact timing and location were unknown. Sarah and Wilson had to maintain readiness for up to 8 hours while remaining completely concealed from roving instructors who were actively searching for their position. Contact, 11 o'clock, approximately 400 yards. Wilson whispered through their private communication system. Sarah shifted her scope slightly and identified 2 instructors moving through the tree line in a pattern designed to locate hidden students. She had to remain perfectly still while they passed within 50 yards of her position. The ghillie suit that had taken her hours to construct properly was about to face its ultimate test. The instructors moved slowly and deliberately, using the same techniques Sarah had been taught to detect concealed positions. They were looking for unnatural shapes, movement, glint from optical equipment, and any other signs that might reveal a hidden sniper team. Sarah controlled her breathing and became as motionless as the fallen log she was positioned against. After what felt like an eternity, the instructors moved on without detecting their position. Wilson gave her a barely perceptible thumbs up, and they continued their vigil. The actual target appeared 6 hours into the exercise, just when fatigue and boredom were beginning to test Sarah's concentration. A figure in civilian clothes emerged from a building at the far end of the valley and began walking toward a vehicle. According to their briefing, this was their target, but they had to positively identify him before engaging. Sarah adjusted her scope and studied the figure carefully. The distance was approximately 950 yards, well within the Barrett's effective range but requiring precise calculation of environmental factors. Wind had shifted slightly since their last measurement, and heat shimmer was becoming more pronounced as the day warmed. Positive identification confirmed, Wilson reported after comparing the figure to photographs in their mission packet. Range 950 yards, target is moving toward the vehicle. Sarah made her final adjustments and settled into her shooting position. Her breathing slowed automatically, and her focus narrowed to the precise sight picture in her scope. The target was moving at a walking pace, but his path was predictable. She would have one clear opportunity as he passed through an open area about 20 yards from the vehicle. Wind from the right, 5 miles per hour, steady, Wilson reported. Temperature 78 degrees rising. Mirage indicates slight upward thermal. Sarah incorporated this information into her sight picture, making minute adjustments to her scope settings. The target continued moving toward his intercept point, unaware that he was being observed from nearly a kilometer away. Target approaching the zone, Wilson said quietly. 15 yards. 10 yards now. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger with perfect smoothness. The Barrett roared, its powerful report echoing across the valley. Through her scope, she saw the target stumble and fall, a direct hit that would have been instantly fatal in a real engagement. Target down, Wilson confirmed. Clean hit center mass, but the exercise wasn't over. As part of the scenario, Sarah and Wilson had to extract from their position without being detected by the quick reaction force that would be searching for them. They had rehearsed this phase extensively, but executing it under pressure while carrying the heavy Barrett rifle system would test all their skills. They moved with practiced efficiency, breaking down their position and erasing any sign of their presence. Sarah slung the Barrett across her back and began moving through the forest, using the concealment techniques she had mastered over the previous weeks. Wilson followed 20 yards behind, watching for pursuit while Sarah navigated toward their predetermined extraction point. The journey took 2 hours of careful movement through dense vegetation. Twice they had to freeze in place as search teams passed nearby, and once Wilson spotted a helicopter conducting aerial reconnaissance of their general area. But their training held, and they reached the extraction point without being detected. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting at the extraction point with several other instructors. His expression was unreadable as Sarah and Wilson emerged from the forest, but she noticed him making notes on a clipboard. Martinez, Wilson, he said formally. Report your exercise results. Wilson delivered a crisp summary of their mission: target identification, engagement, and successful extraction. Rodriguez listened without comment, then dismissed them to join the other candidates who had completed the exercise. Over the next 2 days, the instructors evaluated all aspects of each candidate's performance. Technical shooting skills were obviously important, but they also assessed fieldcraft, tactical decision-making, teamwork, and the ability to function under stress. Some candidates who had been excellent shooters throughout the course were eliminated because they had struggled with other aspects of the role. On the final morning of the course, Rodriguez addressed the remaining candidates. Of the original 24 students, only 16 had successfully completed all requirements. The others had been eliminated at various stages, some for shooting deficiencies, others for problems with fieldcraft or tactical skills, and a few for issues with psychological evaluation. The soldiers standing before me represent some of the finest precision marksmen in the United States Army, Rodriguez said with obvious pride. You have mastered complex technical skills, developed advanced tactical abilities, and proven that you can function effectively under pressure. But remember, you're real. Education begins when you join operational units and start applying these skills in support of actual missions. Sarah felt a surge of accomplishment as Rodriguez read her name from the list of successful candidates. She had not only completed one of the Army's most challenging courses, but had done so with distinction. Her shooting scores had been consistently excellent, and her tactical performance during field exercises had earned high marks from the instructors. But Rodriguez wasn't finished with his remarks. For candidates who have shown exceptional aptitude during training, there are opportunities for additional specialized instruction. These advanced programs prepare soldiers for the most demanding missions in the most challenging environments. He looked directly at Sarah as he continued. Martinez, Thompson, and Davis, see me after this formation. The rest of you will receive your assignments to operational units within the next few days. After the formation dismissed, Sarah approached Rodriguez with curiosity and excitement. She had hoped her performance might lead to additional opportunities but hadn't dared to assume anything. Martinez, Rodriguez said, your performance during this course has been outstanding. Your shooting skills are among the best I've seen, but more importantly, you've demonstrated the tactical thinking and psychological stability required for the most challenging assignments. He paused, studying her with the same careful attention he applied to everything else. There's a program at Fort Bragg that trains soldiers for specialized missions in support of special operations forces. The standards are even higher than what you've experienced here, and the training is correspondingly more intense. Are you interested? Sarah thought about her journey from her grandfather's ranch to this moment. Every step had been more challenging than the last, but each had also been more rewarding. She was being offered the opportunity to join the most elite level of her profession, exactly what she had hoped for when she first enlisted. Yes, Sergeant, she replied without hesitation. I'm very interested. Rodriguez smiled slightly. I thought you might be. Pack your gear and be ready to travel tomorrow morning. Your real education is about to begin. That evening, Sarah called home to share her success with her family. Her grandfather's voice was thick with emotion when she told him about completing sniper school and being selected for advanced training. I'm proud of you, mija, Roberto said. You've proven that you have not just the skill, but the character to serve your country at the highest level. Remember what I always taught you, the weapon is just a tool. It's the person behind it that makes the difference. As Sarah prepared for the next phase of her military career, she reflected on how much she had changed since leaving the ranch. The shy teenager who had practiced shooting at tin cans had become a professional soldier, capable of precision engagement at distances that seemed impossible just months earlier. But more than that, she had discovered reserves of mental strength and determination that she hadn't known she possessed. The challenges ahead would be even greater, but she was confident in her ability to meet them. Her journey toward becoming one of the Army's most elite soldiers was far from over. It was just beginning. Fort Bragg in North Carolina was a completely different world from anything Sarah had experienced. The base was massive, housing multiple special operations units and serving as home to some of the most elite soldiers in the American military. As her transport vehicle passed through the gates, she saw paratroopers conducting training jumps, special forces candidates running in perfect formation, and equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie. The advanced marksmanship unit occupied a discrete corner of the sprawling base, its buildings unmarked and surrounded by training areas that disappeared into dense pine forests. Sarah reported to Colonel Morrison, a tall woman in her 40s whose presence commanded immediate respect. Morrison had the bearing of someone who had seen combat in multiple theaters and had survived experiences that most people couldn't imagine. Sergeant Martinez, Morrison said, reviewing Sarah's file with obvious interest. Your instructors at Benning speak very highly of your abilities. Master Sergeant Rodriguez specifically recommended you for our program. Which doesn't happen often. Sarah stood at attention, unsure how to respond to praise from such a senior officer. Morrison continued, what we do here is different from conventional sniper operations. You'll be supporting special operations missions that require absolute precision under the most challenging possible conditions. The margin for error is essentially zero, and the consequences of failure can be catastrophic. Over the following days, Sarah met the other soldiers in her training cohort. There were only 8 of them, all carefully selected from various special operations units or advanced training programs. Each had already proven themselves exceptional soldiers, but they would be tested in ways none of them had previously experienced. The training began with extreme long-range shooting, distances that pushed the limits of both equipment and human capability. Sarah found herself engaging targets at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards, where factors like Earth's rotation and atmospheric pressure variations became significant considerations. The Barrett.50 caliber rifle became her primary tool, but she also trained with other specialized weapon systems designed for specific mission requirements. Staff Sergeant Chen, her primary instructor, was a veteran of multiple combat deployments who had earned legendary status among special operations snipers. He approached training with scientific precision, breaking down every aspect of long-range shooting into measurable components that could be analyzed and improved. At these distances, Chen explained during a particularly challenging training session, "You're not just shooting at a target, you're solving a complex physics problem in real time. Wind speed varies at different altitudes along the bullet's path. Temperature changes affect both your weapon and the air density. Even the rotation of the Earth becomes a factor at extreme range." Sarah absorbed these lessons with the same intensity she had brought to every previous stage of her training. She filled notebooks with ballistics calculations, environmental data, and tactical observations. Her shooting scores were consistently excellent, but she was more interested in understanding the science behind each successful shot. The fieldcraft training at Fort Bragg was correspondingly more advanced. Sarah learned to operate in urban environments, constructing concealed positions and buildings that could be maintained for days while supporting ongoing operations. She practiced infiltration techniques that allowed her to move through hostile territory undetected, sometimes traveling for miles to reach optimal firing positions. One exercise required her to establish a position in a mock urban environment while role players searched for her location. She spent 18 hours concealed in a building, maintaining observation on multiple target areas while avoiding detection by systematic searches. The physical discomfort was intense, but the mental challenge was even greater. She had to remain alert and ready to engage targets while dealing with fatigue, hunger, and the psychological pressure of remaining motionless for extended periods. "Urban operations present unique challenges," explained Captain Torres during a tactical briefing. "Buildings provide concealment, but they also limit your escape routes and create acoustic signatures that can reveal your position. You have to balance the advantages of a protected firing position against the risks of becoming trapped in a compromised location." Sarah's partner for these exercises was Sergeant First Class Anderson, a Special Forces veteran who had served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Anderson was initially skeptical about working with someone so young and relatively inexperienced, but Sarah's consistent performance and professional attitude gradually earned his respect. "You think differently than most shooters I've worked with," Anderson observed after a particularly successful exercise. "Most people get focused on the technical aspects of the shot and lose sight of the tactical situation. You seem to maintain awareness of both simultaneously." Sarah had learned this approach from her grandfather, who always emphasized understanding the complete hunting situation rather than just focusing on the immediate target. This holistic perspective served her well in complex training scenarios that required balancing multiple considerations simultaneously. The psychological training at Fort Bragg was more intensive than anything she had previously experienced. Sarah worked with military psychologists who specialized in preparing soldiers for the unique stresses of special operations missions. They conducted detailed evaluations of her decision-making processes under extreme pressure and taught her techniques for managing stress that could literally mean the difference between mission success and failure. Dr. Williams, a civilian psychologist who had worked with special operations forces for over a decade, conducted individual sessions with each trainee. Her approach was direct and sometimes uncomfortable, but Sarah quickly understood its importance. In conventional military operations, soldiers typically work as part of larger units with multiple layers of support and oversight. Dr. Williams explained during one of their sessions. Special operations snipers often work alone or in very small teams, making critical decisions with limited information and no opportunity for second opinions. The psychological pressure can be overwhelming if you're not properly prepared. Sarah learned techniques for compartmentalizing stress, maintaining focus during extended operations, and making rapid decisions based on incomplete information. The training included realistic scenarios designed to simulate the psychological pressure of actual combat missions, where a single moment of hesitation or error could have catastrophic consequences. One particularly challenging exercise required Sarah to maintain a firing position for 36 hours while dealing with various psychological stressors: loud noises, sleep deprivation, deliberately confusing communications, and time pressure that made careful decision-making extremely difficult. She had to identify and engage multiple targets while instructors deliberately provided conflicting information and created artificial emergencies designed to test her judgment. The exercise pushed her to the edge of her psychological limits, but she managed to complete all assigned tasks successfully. More importantly, she learned to recognize her own stress responses and develop techniques for maintaining peak performance even when operating under extreme pressure. Mental preparation is just as important as physical training, Chen reminded the class after reviewing the exercise results. In real operations, you might spend days in position waiting for a single shot opportunity. Your ability to remain calm, alert, and ready to perform at that critical moment can determine whether the mission succeeds or fails. The final phase of training involved live fire exercises, using actual special operations scenarios based on real-world missions. Sarah learned about the command structure and communication protocols used in these operations, and how precision marksmen integrated with ground forces to provide critical support during the most dangerous phases of missions. During one memorable exercise, Sarah provided overwatch for a simulated hostage rescue operation. She had to establish a concealed position that allowed observation of multiple buildings while maintaining the ability to engage threats that might emerge from any direction. The scenario required her to coordinate with ground forces through radio communications while making split-second decisions about when to engage targets and when to hold fire to avoid endangering friendly forces. The exercise concluded successfully, but Sarah was struck by the complexity of the decision-making process. Every shot had to be evaluated not just for its technical feasibility, but for its tactical implications and potential impact on the overall mission. The responsibility was enormous, but she found herself excited rather than intimidated by the challenge. Colonel Morrison conducted the final evaluation personally, reviewing each trainee's performance across all aspects of the program. Sarah felt confident about her technical shooting abilities, but was less certain about how her tactical and psychological performance would be assessed. Sergeant Martinez, Morrison said during their private evaluation session, "Your shooting skills are excellent, but that's not what sets you apart from other candidates. What's impressed your instructors is your ability to maintain situational awareness while performing complex technical tasks under pressure." Morrison paused, studying Sarah with the same careful attention she applied to everything else. "There's a unit that conducts some of our most sensitive operations. They've requested additional precision marksmen, and I believe you would be an excellent fit for their requirements." Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly. She had hoped her performance might lead to assignment with an elite unit, but hadn't dared to assume anything. "The unit operates globally and conducts missions that you'll never be able to discuss with anyone outside the organization," Morrison continued. "The operational tempo is high, the training never stops, and the margin for error is essentially zero. But for the right person, it's the most rewarding assignment in the military." That evening, Sarah called her family to share the news of her successful completion of the advanced program. Her brother Miguel, who had been following her military career with obvious pride, asked about her next assignment. "I can't tell you much about it," Sarah explained, "but it's exactly what I hoped for when I first enlisted. I'll be using everything I've learned to support missions that really matter." Miguel understood the implications without needing detailed explanations. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "You've accomplished something remarkable." Her grandfather's reaction was characteristically direct. "You've proven yourself at every level, Mija. Now the real work begins. Remember what I taught you about responsibility. With great skill comes great obligation to use it wisely." As Sarah prepared for her new assignment, she reflected on her journey from the ranch in Texas to this moment. Every challenge had prepared her for the next level, and every success had opened doors to greater opportunities. She was no longer the uncertain teenager who had first visited the recruiting station. She had become one of the most highly trained precision marksmen in the American military. But she also understood that her education was far from complete. The real test would come when she applied her skills in actual combat operations, where the targets would be real, and the consequences of success or failure would affect real people in real situations. She was ready for that challenge. Colonel Sarah Martinez walked slowly across the familiar grounds of Fort Benning, her polished boots clicking against the concrete pathway that connected the various training facilities. At 35, she commanded the Army's premier sniper training program, responsible for developing the most elite marksmen in the American military. The eagle insignia on her collar represented nearly 2 decades of exceptional service, but today she felt the weight of years in a way she never had before. The Barrett.50 caliber rifle she carried was not just any weapon. It was the same rifle she had used during her operational years, carefully maintained and still perfectly accurate after thousands of rounds fired in training and combat. Today, she was carrying it to the range for a special demonstration, but first she had stopped by her office to retrieve a small item that had been waiting for her return. The 3,200-meter Marksman medal sat in its presentation case on her desk, the brass gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She had earned this recognition 5 years earlier, during what would become her final combat mission, a shot that pushed the absolute limits of both technology and human capability. The mission had been successful, but it had also marked the end of her operational career and the beginning of her transition to leadership and training roles. Sarah picked up the medal and studied it carefully. The inscription was simple: 3,200-meter confirmed kill, Afghanistan 2019. What it didn't capture was the complexity of that mission, the hours of preparation, the weight of responsibility, or the lives that had been saved by that single, perfectly placed shot. She walked to the window and looked out at the training ranges where the next generation of snipers was learning the same skills she had mastered years earlier. Some of them would go on to operational assignments like hers, while others would find different paths within the military. All of them were learning that precision marksmanship was as much about character and judgment as it was about technical skill. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the same instructor who had first recognized her potential years ago, entered the office. Now in his 50s, Rodriguez served as Sarah's senior enlisted advisor, helping to design and implement training programs that reflected the latest lessons learned from combat operations. "Colonel, the demonstration is scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, Rodriguez said. "The VIP guests have arrived and the candidates are assembled on the range." Sarah nodded, securing the medal in her breast pocket and picking up her rifle. Today's demonstration was for a group of senior military leaders and Defense Department officials who were evaluating funding for advanced marksmanship programs. Her job was to show them what properly trained snipers could accomplish, and why investing in this capability was essential for national security. As they walked toward the range, Rodriguez spoke quietly about the candidates in the current class. "We have some exceptional talent in this group, Colonel. Martinez, the young woman from California, reminds me of someone else I knew at that age." Sarah smiled at the reference. She had been watching Private Martinez's progress with interest, recognizing in the young soldier the same combination of natural ability, determination, and teachability that had characterized her own early military career. The demonstration range was impressive, targets at distances ranging from 800 to 1,500 yards, each requiring different techniques and considerations. Sarah would engage targets at progressively longer ranges while explaining the principles and procedures to the assembled observers. General Adams, the senior visiting official, approached Sarah as she prepared for the demonstration. "Colonel Martinez, I've heard remarkable things about your program and your own operational record. I understand you hold several marksmanship records." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied. "What we do here is develop more than just accurate shooters. We develop soldiers who can make critical decisions under extreme pressure and perform at the highest level when lives depend on their abilities." The demonstration began with targets at 800 yards, challenging shots that required solid fundamentals but were well within the capabilities of properly trained marksmen. Sarah engaged each target while explaining the factors she was considering: wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, and range estimation. As the distances increased, the complexity of the calculations grew correspondingly. At beyond 200 yards, Sarah had to account for the Coriolis effect caused by Earth's rotation. At 1,500 yards, minute variations in ammunition performance became significant factors. Each shot at these extreme ranges represents the solution to a complex physics problem, Sarah explained to the assembled observers. But in operational situations, soldiers have to solve these problems quickly, often under enemy fire, while making life or death decisions about target identification and engagement. Her shots were consistently accurate, striking each target precisely where she intended. But she was careful to emphasize that technical shooting ability was only part of what made an effective military sniper. The most important qualities we develop in our students are judgment, patience, and moral courage, she continued. These soldiers will be asked to make decisions that have profound consequences, often with limited information and no opportunity for consultation. After the formal demonstration, General Adams asked Sarah about her own operational experience. She spoke briefly about her deployments and the types of missions she had conducted, but was careful not to provide details that might compromise operational security. "What was your most challenging shot?" he asked. Sarah touched the metal case in her pocket. "I once engaged a target at 200 meters under extremely difficult conditions. It required 4 hours of preparation and environmental observation, and I had only one opportunity to succeed. The shot was successful, but what made it truly challenging wasn't the distance. It was the responsibility of knowing that failure would have cost innocent lives." Later that afternoon, Sarah found herself back on the range with Private Martinez, providing individual instruction, while the other candidates practiced basic techniques. The young soldier reminded her strongly of herself at the same age, eager to learn, naturally gifted, but still developing the judgment and maturity that would be essential for operational success. "What's the most important thing you've learned so far?" Sarah asked as Martinez prepared for a shot at 600 yards. Colonel Sarah Martinez walked slowly across the familiar grounds of Fort Benning, her polished boots clicking against the concrete pathway that connected the various training facilities. At 35, she commanded the Army's premier sniper training program, responsible for developing the most elite marksmen in the American military. The eagle insignia on her collar represented nearly 2 decades of exceptional service, but today she felt the weight of years in a way she never had before. The Barrett.50 caliber rifle she carried was not just any weapon. It was the same rifle she had used during her operational years, carefully maintained and still perfectly accurate after thousands of rounds fired in training and combat. Today, she was carrying it to the range for a special demonstration, but first she had stopped by her office to retrieve a small item that had been waiting for her return. The 3,200-meter Marksman medal sat in its presentation case on her desk, the brass gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She had earned this recognition 5 years earlier, during what would become her final combat mission, a shot that pushed the absolute limits of both technology and human capability. The mission had been successful, but it had also marked the end of her operational career and the beginning of her transition to leadership and training roles. Sarah picked up the medal and studied it carefully. The inscription was simple: 3,200-meter confirmed kill, Afghanistan 2019. What it didn't capture was the complexity of that mission, the hours of preparation, the weight of responsibility, or the lives that had been saved by that single, perfectly placed shot. She walked to the window and looked out at the training ranges where the next generation of snipers was learning the same skills she had mastered years earlier. Some of them would go on to operational assignments like hers, while others would find different paths within the military. All of them were learning that precision marksmanship was as much about character and judgment as it was about technical skill. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the same instructor who had first recognized her potential years ago, entered the office. Now in his 50s, Rodriguez served as Sarah's senior enlisted advisor, helping to design and implement training programs that reflected the latest lessons learned from combat operations. "Colonel, the demonstration is scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, Rodriguez said. "The VIP guests have arrived and the candidates are assembled on the range." Sarah nodded, securing the medal in her breast pocket and picking up her rifle. Today's demonstration was for a group of senior military leaders and Defense Department officials who were evaluating funding for advanced marksmanship programs. Her job was to show them what properly trained snipers could accomplish, and why investing in this capability was essential for national security. As they walked toward the range, Rodriguez spoke quietly about the candidates in the current class. "We have some exceptional talent in this group, Colonel. Martinez, the young woman from California, reminds me of someone else I knew at that age." Sarah smiled at the reference. She had been watching Private Martinez's progress with interest, recognizing in the young soldier the same combination of natural ability, determination, and teachability that had characterized her own early military career. The demonstration range was impressive. Targets at distances ranging from 800 to 1,500 yards, each requiring different techniques and considerations. Sarah would engage targets at progressively longer ranges while explaining the principles and procedures to the assembled observers. General Adams, the senior visiting official, approached Sarah as she prepared for the demonstration. "Colonel Martinez, I've heard remarkable things about your program and your own operational record. I understand you hold several marksmanship records." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied. "What we do here is develop more than just accurate shooters. We develop soldiers who can make critical decisions under extreme pressure and perform at the highest level when lives depend on their abilities." The demonstration began with targets at 800 yards, challenging shots that required solid fundamentals but were well within the capabilities of properly trained marksmen. Sarah engaged each target while explaining the factors she was considering: wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, and range estimation. As the distances increased, the complexity of the calculations grew correspondingly. At beyond 200 yards, Sarah had to account for the Coriolis effect caused by Earth's rotation. At 1,500 yards, minute variations in ammunition performance became significant factors. Each shot at these extreme ranges represents the solution to a complex physics problem, Sarah explained to the assembled observers. But in operational situations, soldiers have to solve these problems quickly, often under enemy fire, while making life-or-death decisions about target identification and engagement. Her shots were consistently accurate, striking each target precisely where she intended. But she was careful to emphasize that technical shooting ability was only part of what made an effective military sniper. "The most important qualities we develop in our students are judgment, patience, and moral courage," she continued. "These soldiers will be asked to make decisions that have profound consequences, often with limited information and no opportunity for consultation." After the formal demonstration, General Adams asked Sarah about her own operational experience. She spoke briefly about her deployments and the types of missions she had conducted, but was careful not to provide details that might compromise operational security. "What was your most challenging shot?" he asked. Sarah touched the metal case in her pocket. "I once engaged a target at 3,200 meters under extremely difficult conditions. It required 4 hours of preparation and environmental observation, and I had only one opportunity to succeed. The shot was successful, but what made it truly challenging wasn't the distance. It was the responsibility of knowing that failure would have cost innocent lives." Later that afternoon, Sarah found herself back on the range with Private Martinez, providing individual instruction, while the other candidates practiced basic techniques. The young soldier reminded her strongly of herself at the same age, eager to learn, naturally gifted, but still developing the judgment and maturity that would be essential for operational success. "What's the most important thing you've learned so far?" Sarah asked as Martinez prepared for a shot at 600 yards. Martinez considered the question carefully before responding. "That shooting is the easy part, ma'am. The hard part is knowing when to shoot and when not to shoot." Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's a lesson that some soldiers never learn, even after years of experience. The fact that you understand it now suggests you have the potential to become truly exceptional at this profession." As evening approached, Sarah walked alone to her favorite spot on the base, a small hill overlooking the main training ranges. From here, she could see the entire complex where she had spent so much of her military career. First as a student and now as the senior instructor, she removed the 3,200-meter medal from her pocket and studied it again in the fading light. The medal represented the technical pinnacle of her operational career, but it also symbolized something larger, the culmination of years of training, experience, and personal growth that had transformed her from an uncertain teenager into one of the Army's most capable officers. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her grandfather, Roberto, now in his 80s but still living on the ranch in Texas. "Saw the news article about your promotion ceremony," the message read. "Very proud of you, Mia. You've honored our family and your country." Sarah smiled, remembering the countless hours she had spent with her grandfather, learning not just shooting techniques but the values of service, responsibility, and dedication that had guided her throughout her military career. As she walked back toward her quarters, Sarah thought about the path that had brought her to this point. Every challenge had prepared her for the next level of responsibility, and every success had opened doors to greater opportunities to serve. Tomorrow she would continue the work of training the next generation of precision marksmen, passing on not just technical skills, but the wisdom and judgment that could only be gained through experience. Some of her students would go on to operational assignments like hers, while others would find different ways to serve their country, but all of them would carry forward the lessons she had learned during her own journey. That precision marksmanship was about much more than accurate shooting. That true skill came from the combination of technical ability and moral character, and that the greatest honor in military service came from using one's abilities to protect others and serve something larger than oneself. The Barrett rifle rested easily in her hands as she walked, as familiar and comfortable as it had been during her operational years. But now it served a different purpose, not as a tool of war but as an instrument of instruction, helping her prepare others to carry the same responsibilities she had once borne. Colonel Sarah Martinez had completed her transformation from student to teacher, from operator to leader. Her medal represented past achievements, but her real legacy would be measured in the soldiers she trained and the lives they would save through the application of skills and judgment she had helped them develop. The commander had indeed strolled beyond her Barrett.50, but she had never forgotten the lessons it had taught her about precision, responsibility, and service.